The deafening roar of the spaceship's engines filled Captain Eric Rhodes' ears as the craft plummeted through the atmosphere, its controls flashing red with warnings. He gritted his teeth, gripping the seat as the planet below loomed ever closer. The ship had been damaged by an unexpected enemy attack, and now, with the fuel almost depleted and systems failing, survival was a question of luck. The mission? Simple enough. Land, scout, gather information about the Iteri, an alien species believed to be fierce and powerful, and report back. But things had already gone terribly wrong. The storm outside raged, lightning crackling across the sky like some ancient wrathful god. Captain Rhodes knew this wasn't just an ordinary storm. The planetary sensors had picked up some strange, energy-based signatures. Something was alive out there, something powerful. The Iteri had been known to inhabit the thick, jungle-covered continents of the planet, but nobody had ever come back from an encounter with them. The ship hit the atmosphere hard, and the world outside seemed to blur as the craft spun uncontrollably. Rhodes fought against the violent forces, doing everything he could to stabilize the craft. It finally hit the ground with a thunderous crash. Metal shrieked, and the sound of tearing hull reverberated through the air as the ship finally came to a halt. Dust and smoke filled the cockpit, and for a long moment, Rhodes could barely hear his own heartbeat. He quickly checked his survival pack, making sure his energy weapon, ration packs, and emergency beacon were still intact. Then, a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. The crash had knocked him unconscious for a few minutes, but he forced himself awake. His surroundings were eerily quiet, aside from the persistent howling wind. Rhodes opened the cockpit door, stepping into the wreckage. The once sleek, high-tech ship was now a twisted mass of metal, half buried in the mud of an unfamiliar jungle. With nothing left to do but press on, Rhodes activated his tactical HUD. A holographic display appeared before his eyes, outlining his location in relation to his mission objective. The Iteri. According to his orders, the Iteri were to be studied, their tactics, technology, and behavior carefully documented. The Galactic Council had been particularly interested in their potential as allies, or enemies, depending on how the situation unfolded. There was no time to waste. He couldn't afford to sit idly. The storm was closing in, and the dense jungle around him seemed far from welcoming. He set out, using the natural camouflage of his suit to blend into the surroundings, activating its cloaking function to avoid detection. The jungle was thick with alien vegetation, unfamiliar sounds echoing in every direction, and something in the air made his skin crawl. The temperature was hot, stifling, but there was something more, something alive. As he moved deeper into the jungle, the sense of being watched intensified. Suddenly, a rustling in the trees caught his attention. He paused, silently slipping behind a massive, twisted tree trunk, his hand going to his weapon. He could hear footsteps now, heavy, deliberate. His pulse quickened, but he kept his breath steady. The Iteri. He had no idea what they looked like, but he had heard they were enormous, towering warriors with strength far beyond that of any human. A shadow moved swiftly through the trees, and Rhodes barely had time to react. His heart skipped a beat as a figure emerged from the foliage. A towering alien woman, her skin a deep shade of green, her eyes glowing bright with intensity. She was clad in what appeared to be a form of armor, her long hair flowing behind her as she moved. And there was no mistaking the strength in her posture, the way she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never known weakness. Rhodes barely had time to think before she froze, sensing his presence. The cloaking device did its job, but for some reason, the Iteri could still sense him, her eyes narrowing as if she could pierce the camouflage. He didn't dare move, his finger hovering over the trigger of his weapon. But before he could decide whether to fire or retreat, she spoke in a language he didn't understand, her voice harsh and commanding. "Who is this?" she said in her strange tongue, taking a few more steps forward. She was close now, too close. Rhodes quickly analyzed his surroundings. He could fight, or he could run. But where could he run to? The jungle was vast, and she wasn't alone. From the corner of his eye, he saw two more figures moving toward him. More Iteri, no doubt. He didn't stand a chance if they decided to attack. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself. His military training kicked in, and Rhodes immediately dropped his cloak. He stepped forward, keeping his hands visible in a non-threatening manner. "I'm a human," he said slowly, his voice steady but filled with tension. "I mean you no harm." The Iteri woman tilted her head, as if considering him. Her hand rested on the hilt of a large blade at her side, and she studied him like he was an oddity, a strange, untested thing in their world. The second Iteri warrior, who had moved closer behind her, raised a weapon, a long, sharp spear, its tip glowing menacingly. The third woman stood farther off, observing, waiting. Rhodes didn't move. He knew any wrong step could mean his end. But as the first Iteri warrior, Vera, he noticed her name etched into the armor. Took another step closer. Something unexpected happened. She paused, and the cold, calculating look in her eyes softened, just slightly. Her brow furrowed, her gaze flickering to his human form, then back to the others. "I don't believe it," she said softly, her voice low but full of awe. "A male, on our land." Rhodes, though still in a perilous situation, couldn't help but notice the hesitation in her voice. He could feel the unease in her, the confusion that only someone who had never encountered a man could have. The Iteri were a species made up entirely of women. Strong, powerful, independent warriors. What was he, a human male, doing here? Before he could respond, a sudden movement from the jungle edge caught everyone off guard. A burst of energy, bright, explosive, suddenly lit up the sky, shaking the earth beneath their feet. The Iteri warriors whipped around, their weapons raised, scanning for the source of the disturbance. For a moment, Rhodes thought they might forget him entirely, but then Vera's eyes locked onto him once more. "Stay quiet," she whispered urgently. The previously calm warrior was now on edge. She motioned for the others to retreat into the jungle, signaling Rhodes to follow her. Rhodes hesitated. What was going on? Who else was out there? As the group vanished into the trees, moving swiftly and silently, the eerie sound of alien footsteps filled the air. He had no choice now but to follow. The game had changed. This wasn't about surviving alone anymore. He was caught in a world he didn't understand, facing enemies far more advanced than any he had ever encountered. The suspense hung thick in the air as the jungle closed in around him. The storm's fury seemed to intensify, but now, the true battle had just begun. The dense jungle swallowed them whole as they moved deeper into the heart of the Iteri territory. Captain Eric Rhodes kept his footing steady despite the slick, muddy terrain. His boots sank into the wet ground with every step, but he stayed alert, his mind focused on the Iteri warriors who surrounded him. Vera, the first Iteri he had encountered, led the way with her spear raised high, the glowing tip cutting through the darkness of the stormy jungle night. Her comrades followed closely behind, but they remained unusually quiet, almost too quiet, as if they were expecting something to happen. The eerie silence weighed heavily on Rhodes. He wasn't used to being the one out of place, but here, in this alien jungle, he felt like a stranger in a strange land. Everything about the Iteri was different. Their culture, their technology, even the way they moved. It was as if they were from a completely different world. And yet, despite the vast differences, there was a strange sense of connection. They were all sentient beings, after all, bound by the same desire to survive and understand the world around them. As they moved through the thick undergrowth, Rhodes couldn't help but feel a growing tension between himself and the Iteri. They had never seen a man before. Their species had evolved without males, and the idea of a human male existing on their planet was a complete anomaly. It was a strange thought, but it made him realize just how far he was from home. These women had no idea how to relate to him, and the look in their eyes. Confusion, curiosity, and wariness made that clear. Rhodes was used to being the outsider. He had been on missions before where he was the only human in a sea of aliens, but this situation was different. These women were not like the others he had met. They were warriors, strong, proud, and fiercely independent. Their bodies were built for combat, their muscles honed by years of training and battle. They were a race of female warriors who had never known a man in their entire existence. And now, here he was, an alien in their midst, trying to survive. The strange, quiet atmosphere continued as they moved deeper into the jungle. Vera occasionally glanced back at him, her sharp eyes scanning him from head to toe, as though she were trying to figure out what exactly he was. She hadn't said much since the encounter, but Rhodes could sense that she was more than just curious. There was a strange kind of wonder in her eyes, as if she had never seen anything like him before. Finally, they reached a clearing, and Rhodes' eyes widened in awe. In the center of the clearing stood a massive structure, an ancient stone temple, its towering columns etched with intricate carvings that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The Iteri had clearly been living in this place for centuries, if not longer. The architecture was unlike anything Rhodes had ever seen, and it struck him how much their civilization had evolved without the influence of men. Vera led him inside the temple, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The others followed silently, their eyes constantly on Rhodes, as if they were unsure of what to make of him. Rhodes couldn't help but feel a little nervous. He had been thrust into a situation he hadn't fully prepared for, and now, the tension was only growing. They entered a large chamber at the center of the temple. It was dimly lit by bioluminescent crystals embedded in the walls. The air was thick with the scent of ancient stone and something else, something he couldn't quite place. As Rhodes stepped inside, he noticed that the Iteri warriors were surrounding him, forming a loose circle. Their eyes were fixed on him, their weapons still at the ready, though no one seemed to be making any immediate moves. Vera stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Tell us, human, what is it that you seek on our world?" Rhodes paused, searching for the right words. The question seemed simple enough, but he knew that answering it wouldn't be. These were not just any aliens. These were warriors. Their lives had been shaped by their culture, their beliefs, and their way of life. They didn't trust easily, especially not a stranger like him. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, and it made him uneasy. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," Rhodes said finally. "I was sent by the Galactic Council to scout and gather information on your species. We've heard of your strength, your resilience. We wanted to know if there was potential for an alliance." The words hung in the air for a moment. Vera's gaze never wavered, but Rhodes could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was trying to understand him, to gauge whether or not he was a threat. The silence stretched on, and Rhodes felt his heart rate quicken. "You are the first male to set foot on our land in centuries," Vera said, her voice a little softer now. "Why should we trust you?" Rhodes took a deep breath. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he said, "but I believe that we can help each other. There's a war coming, a war that could destroy both of our species if we don't work together." Vera's expression softened ever so slightly, but there was still a guardedness to her. She wasn't ready to fully open up to him, and Rhodes understood that. He wasn't here to win her over in one conversation. He needed to show her that he wasn't a threat. The other Iteri warriors had been silent up until now, but one of them, a younger woman with short, dark hair, stepped forward. "You speak of war," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. "But we have never needed help before. Our people are strong. We do not rely on others to fight our battles." Rhodes met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I understand that. But this isn't a normal war. It's a war against an enemy unlike any you've ever faced before. We've fought them before, and they are powerful, too powerful to face alone." The room fell silent again as the Iteri warriors exchanged glances. Rhodes could see that they were uncertain, unsure of how to proceed. They were warriors, yes, but they were also proud. The idea of asking for help, or even accepting it, was something they had never considered. The concept of cooperation with another species, especially one so different from their own, was foreign to them. Vera was the first to break the silence. You speak of enemies and wars, but you have yet to tell us what kind of enemies you face. Rhodes nodded. They're called the Krylocks, a race of machines, A-driven warriors who are bent on conquering and destroying everything in their path. They have weapons that can wipe out entire planets in a single strike. The room grew colder at the mention of the Krylocks. Rhodes could see the fear in their eyes now, fear mixed with disbelief. The Iteri had never encountered machines like the Krylocks before, and the idea of such an advanced threat was hard to comprehend. Vera stepped closer to Rhodes, her gaze intense. "We do not fear machines," she said firmly. "We are that we Teri. We fight with our hands, with our blades. We have faced many dangers, and we have never lost." Rhodes knew that this was a critical moment. He could sense the pride in Vera's words, and he understood it. The Iteri were a proud people, a species of warriors who had never known defeat. But the Krylocks were something else. The machines were relentless, calculating, and unforgiving. No amount of strength or skill could stand against them if they didn't work together. "I know your people are strong," Rhodes said, his voice steady. "But this enemy is different, and together we might just stand a chance." The room grew quiet as the Iteri considered his words. Vera looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was no sound but the distant hum of the storm outside, and Rhodes wondered if he had said too much or too little. Finally, Vera spoke again. "We will consider your words human," she said. "But know this, if you are lying, if you are trying to deceive us, we will not hesitate to end you." Rhodes nodded, his face grim. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The tension in the room was palpable, and Rhodes knew that the next few days would be crucial. The Iteri might not trust him yet, but they were listening. And that was a start. Days passed since Captain Eric Rhodes had first arrived in the heart of the Iteri territory. The quiet tension he had felt since stepping foot on their soil had only deepened, settling into his bones like a weight he couldn't shake off. It wasn't just the constant watchful eyes of the Iteri warriors that made him feel uneasy. It was the feeling of isolation, of being the only human in a world that was so different from the one he had known. The Iteri were unlike any species he had encountered before. Their culture was complex, their customs alien, and their wariness toward him was thick enough to cut with a knife. Vera, the first Iteri he had met, had softened slightly over the past few days, but the wariness in her eyes remained. Her comrades were less open. They watched him as though he were an unpredictable force, something to be feared and respected, but never fully trusted. Captain Rhodes couldn't blame them. In their eyes, he was nothing more than an anomaly, an intruder on their land. Yet, despite the uncertainty, he couldn't ignore the strange bond that was slowly forming between him and the Iteri. He had been sent to this strange planet to scout, to collect information, and to convince the Iteri to consider an alliance. The Krylocks were a growing threat, one that could obliterate entire civilizations in the blink of an eye. And if the Iteri didn't ally with humanity, the war would be lost before it even began. But these were not just cold facts. These were real lives, real people, and as he spent more time with the Iteri, he found himself becoming more invested in their survival. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the jungle in a soft orange glow, Captain Rhodes found himself sitting by a fire with Vera. The others had gone to their separate quarters for the night, leaving the two of them alone by the flickering flames. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them, and for a brief moment, Rhodes felt the tension ease. Vera sat across from him, her eyes flicking toward the flames before returning to him. She had always been strong and stoic, but tonight there was something different in her gaze, a softness that hadn't been there before. The walls she had carefully built around herself seemed to be crumbling, just a little. "You've been here for days now," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Why do you fight? Why do humans keep fighting?" Rhodes paused, his gaze fixed on the fire. The question caught him off guard. It was simple enough, yet it cut to the core of everything he had been trained to believe. Why did they fight? Why did humanity, despite all the odds stacked against them, continue to resist, to push forward? "We fight because we have no choice," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "We fight for survival. For the people we love. We fight for the future, even when it seems impossible." Vera didn't respond immediately. Her gaze softened even more as she looked down at the fire, her hands gently clasped in her lap. Rhodes could tell that her mind was working through his words, trying to understand. The Iteri had never known such a fight, not like this. Their wars were fought with honor, with strategy, with the strength of their bodies. They didn't fight like humans, out of desperation, out of necessity. "Humans are so different," Vera whispered, almost to herself. "You fight like there's something more at stake, something more than just your lives." Rhodes met her gaze, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We do," he said quietly. "We fight for each other." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a strange connection, one that neither of them had expected to form. In that quiet moment, Rhodes realized that he wasn't just fighting for an alliance with the Iteri anymore. He was fighting for something deeper, a bond, a relationship, something far beyond what he had initially set out to accomplish. But as the firelight flickered and the night grew colder, the emotional weight of their situation began to settle back into the air around them. They were standing on the edge of a precipice, and no matter how much they wanted to deny it, the dangers of the Krylocks were closing in fast. Rhodes could feel the pressure mounting, the tension tightening with every passing moment. There was so much at stake now, so much more than just a military alliance. They were facing the very real possibility of losing everything. Later that night, as Captain Rhodes lay in his quarters, his mind wandered back to the conversation with Vera. He had been a soldier for most of his life, trained to focus on the mission, to put aside anything that might distract him from the task at hand. But as the days wore on, it was getting harder to ignore the emotional toll this mission was taking on him. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was part of this strange, new world. The Iteri had no concept of men in the traditional sense. Their society had evolved in a way that rendered males obsolete. And now, here he was, a human male, thrust into their midst, trying to convince them to fight by his side. It was a difficult position to be in, one that was made even more complicated by the emotional weight of the situation. But he couldn't afford to let those emotions cloud his judgment. If he did, everything would fall apart. The next day, things seemed even more tense than before. The Iteri warriors were more watchful, their eyes darting to him whenever they thought he wasn't paying attention. It wasn't hostility, but it was something close, a deep, unspoken wariness. Rhodes couldn't help but feel the unease gnawing at him, but he pushed it down. He had a job to do, and he couldn't let personal feelings get in the way. Vera approached him as he stood at the edge of the clearing, staring out into the jungle. She seemed more guarded now, her earlier softness replaced by something harder. "You've been speaking to the others," she said, her tone cool. "What are your true intentions, human?" Rhodes turned to face her, surprised by the sudden shift in her demeanor. "My intentions, I've told you what I came here for. I'm trying to stop a war. To save your people." Vera's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice quieter now. "You have a strange way of convincing us, Captain Rhodes. You are a man, a stranger to us. And yet, you expect us to trust you, to fight with you." The words stung, but Rhodes didn't let them show. He had to remind himself that this wasn't just about him. This was bigger than any one person. "I know I'm not what you expected," he said, his voice steady. "But we're facing something far greater than any of us. And if we don't work together, we'll all fall. Vera hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I want to believe you, she said softly, but I don't know if I can. Rhodes didn't have an answer to that. He couldn't force anyone to believe him. All he could do was show them, prove that he was willing to fight beside them, no matter the cost. But as he looked into Vera's eyes, he knew one thing for certain. The emotional battle had only just begun. Captain Eric Rhodes stood at the edge of the makeshift camp, the weight of the upcoming battle pressing down on his shoulders. The dense jungle around him hummed with the sounds of alien wildlife, but his mind was focused elsewhere. The Iteri were no longer just allies to him. They had become something more. Their lives, their survival, had become his responsibility. The invasion was coming. The Krylocks would not be deterred. The war was about to reach their doorstep, and they had to be ready. The night before, the Iteri warriors had gathered in the War Council tent, their faces grim. The intelligence Rhodes had sent back to Earth had confirmed what they had all feared. The Krylocks were preparing a full-scale assault. There was no time to waste. Every warrior, every soldier, had to be prepared to fight. But the Iteri, despite their formidable strength and combat skills, had never faced an enemy like the Krylocks. The Krylocks were ruthless. They had no honor, no mercy. They wiped out entire civilizations without a second thought. The Iteri had to learn quickly, or they would be crushed before they even had a chance to strike back. Vera, who had been watching Rhodes closely, approached him now, her usual calm demeanor replaced with a tense edge. "The others are ready," she said, her voice low, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "But they are scared. They've never fought like this. They don't know what to expect." Rhodes turned to her, meeting her eyes with a look of determination. "Fear is a part of battle," he said, his voice steady. "It's natural. What matters is how we use that fear. If we let it control us, we'll lose. But if we face it, together, we have a chance to win." Vera's gaze softened, but her concern remained. "I'm not afraid," she replied, her voice firm. "But I fear for my people, for my sisters." Captain Rhodes placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of reassurance. "We're in this together, Vera. You and your people have strength beyond what you know. The Krylocks won't know what hit them." As they spoke, the distant hum of engines reached their ears, the sound of the Iteri warships. They had been ready for this moment for days now, preparing for the inevitable clash. But Rhodes couldn't shake the feeling that they were still not fully prepared. The Krylocks were a force unlike any they had encountered before. The Iteri had their warriors, their impressive strength, but the Krylocks had technology that could erase entire planets from existence. It wasn't just about fighting. This was survival. Vera took a deep breath and turned her eyes toward the horizon. "We'll face them together," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And we'll win." Captain Rhodes nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle that was about to unfold would test everything. But one thing was certain. He would fight alongside the Iteri, no matter what it took. As the days passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The Iteri warriors trained harder than ever before, but even their impressive strength couldn't quiet the fear that lurked beneath their stoic expressions. Rhodes watched as they sharpened their weapons, practiced their combat techniques, and strategized. The whole camp was alive with activity, but there was a quiet desperation in their movements. Everyone knew that the invasion could come at any moment, and when it came, it would not be easy. One night, as the sun set and darkness enveloped the jungle, Captain Rhodes sat alone in his quarters, reviewing the battle plans one final time. He ran his fingers over the holographic map of the area, tracing the likely routes the Krylocks would take. They would come from the sky, swift, brutal, and unrelenting. The Iteri had no air defense to speak of. It was a weakness they would have to overcome, and fast. The night was broken by the sudden sound of distant explosions. Rhodes jumped to his feet, adrenaline spiking through his veins. It had started. The Krylocks had arrived. He didn't waste a second. Grabbing his rifle, he bolted out of his quarters and ran toward the command center. The Iteri warriors were already assembling, their faces set with grim determination. Vera was at the front of the group, her eyes locked on the sky. The battle was about to begin. "We need to move quickly," Rhodes said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The Krylocks will be landing soon. We need to get to high ground and defend the perimeter. Vera, I need your warriors to hold the outer defenses while we set up the command center." Vera nodded, her jaw set. "We are ready," she said, her voice steady. "We will not back down." Captain Rhodes turned to the rest of the Iteri warriors, his heart swelling with pride. "This is our home now. We fight for it. We fight for our survival." The warriors roared in response, their battle cries echoing through the jungle. It was a sound that filled Rhodes with both fear and hope. They had no choice but to fight, and fight they would. As the first of the Krylock ships appeared in the sky, Rhodes felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. The invasion had begun. The Iteri warriors took their positions, rifles ready, their faces set in determination. It was then that Rhodes realized the full extent of what was happening. They were outmatched. The Krylock ships were massive, their weaponry capable of leveling entire cities with a single blast. But the Iteri would not run. They would not back down. The first wave of Krylock's troops dropped to the ground, their heavily armored forms a stark contrast to the agile Iteri warriors. Rhodes could see the fear in the eyes of the Iteri as they faced the monstrous invaders. They had never fought an enemy like this, one that had no honor, no compassion, no mercy. "Hold your ground," Rhodes shouted, his voice cutting through the air. "We fight for our homes. We fight for each other." The battle erupted in a blur of violence. The Iteri warriors charged forward, their strength and agility making them a formidable force, but the Krylocks were relentless. Their superior firepower cut down the Iteri's defenses with frightening precision. For every Iteri warrior that fell, another took their place. But Rhodes knew they couldn't keep this up for long. The Krylocks would overwhelm them if they didn't act fast. In the midst of the chaos, Vera fought beside Rhodes, her movements graceful and lethal. She was a true warrior, her determination shining through even as the battle raged around her. But Rhodes could see the exhaustion in her eyes. They were all exhausted, fighting not just for survival, but for something more, something worth protecting. The invasion was far from over. The storm had only just begun. But as the Krylocks' forces pressed forward, Rhodes couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The Iteri were fighting harder than he had ever seen. They were stronger than they knew. And together, they just might have a chance. As the first wave of Krylock's troops descended upon them, Captain Rhodes knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The fight for survival had begun in earnest, and it would not be an easy road ahead. But with the Iteri by his side, he was ready for whatever the storm would bring. The battle raged on. The once lush jungle was now a war zone, scared with craters and filled with the sound of explosions, the hiss of blaster fire, and the sharp clash of metal against metal. The Krylocks' forces had landed in full force, their numbers overwhelming. The Iteri warriors, despite their courage and strength, were struggling to hold the line. Rhodes fought beside them, his rifle blazing with each shot, but he could feel the tide of the battle turning against them. Vera was by his side, her strength and speed unmatched, but even she seemed to be tiring. Sweat poured down her face as she cut down another Krylock soldier, her blade flashing in the dim light. Yet the Krylocks were relentless, and for every soldier the Iteri took down, two more seemed to take their place. Rhodes could see the fear in the eyes of his allies, and it made his stomach tighten. They had already suffered so much. How much longer could they last? "Captain," Vera shouted over the chaos, her voice strained. "We need to fall back. We can't hold them much longer." Rhodes glanced over his shoulder at the Iteri defenses. The perimeter was beginning to collapse. The Krylocks had broken through their outer lines, and there were now too many of them to fight off. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the magnitude of their situation. They had no choice but to retreat, or they would be wiped out entirely. "No," Rhodes shouted back, his voice cutting through the noise. "We stand our ground. We fight until the end." But even as he said the words, he knew they couldn't hold out forever. The Krylocks were too powerful, too well-equipped. They had underestimated their enemies. Rhodes gritted his teeth, frustration and desperation flooding his mind. They needed a miracle. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the first betrayal came. It happened so quickly that Rhodes didn't see it coming. One of the Itari warriors, a trusted ally who had fought alongside them since the beginning, turned his weapon on them. His eyes were wild with fear, and his hands trembled as he pointed his blaster at Rhodes. "We're doomed," the warrior hissed. "We can't win. The Krylocks will destroy us all. I can't die here. I won't." Rhodes reacted instinctively, drawing his sidearm and shooting the traitor before he could fire. The warrior crumpled to the ground, his blaster falling from his hand. Rhodes stood over him for a moment, his chest heaving as the reality of what had just happened sank in. A part of him wanted to feel anger, but instead he felt only sadness. The warrior's fear had driven him to betray his own people, and now he was dead because of it. The war had cost them so much already, and now it had taken yet another life. Vera, having witnessed the betrayal, looked at Rhodes with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. He just gave up," she whispered, her voice filled with shock. "It's not over yet," Rhodes said, his voice grim. "We can still win this, but we need to stay focused. We can't afford to lose anyone else to fear." But as he turned back to the battle, he saw the truth. More and more of the Itari warriors were retreating, abandoning their positions, and running for cover. It was every soldier for themselves now. The Krylocks had them cornered, and there was nowhere to run. The Itari were broken. And the worst part was, they didn't even know if they could count on the humans anymore. As the battle continued to spiral out of control, Vera's voice broke through Rhodes' thoughts. "Captain," she said, her voice urgent. "The command center. It's going to be overrun. We need to protect it. If the Krylocks take it, we lose everything." Rhodes looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of their situation. She was right. The command center was their last line of defense. If the Krylocks breached it, they would have complete control of the battlefield. There was no choice. "Get to the command center," Rhodes said, his voice firm. "I'll cover you. We can't let them take it." Vera didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted toward the command center, her warriors following close behind. Rhodes stood still for a moment, watching them go. He knew that the moment he left his position, the Krylocks would push forward, and the Itari would be overrun. But he had no choice. They had to protect the command center at all costs. Rhodes began to move through the battlefield, making his way toward the command center. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground was littered with the fallen. The screams of the wounded filled his ears, but he pushed them out of his mind. He had one objective: get to the command center. As he approached, he saw the Itari warriors holding the line, but they were struggling. The Krylocks had reached the perimeter, and their weapons were overwhelming. Rhodes knew that if they didn't get reinforcements soon, they would lose everything. But the reinforcements were nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, a blast rocked the ground beside him, throwing him to the dirt. Rhodes staggered to his feet, his head spinning. He could hear the sounds of battle growing closer, but he couldn't see the enemy. The Krylocks had cloaking technology, another advantage they held over the Itari. Rhodes cursed under his breath and continued forward, his pulse racing. Just as he reached the command center, he was confronted by another traitor. This time, it was one of his own, one of the human soldiers who had fought beside him from the start. The soldier's eyes were wide with panic, his weapon shaking in his hands. "We're not going to make it," the soldier said, his voice cracking. The Itari are already losing. It's over. Rhodes shook his head, refusing to accept it. No, we're not giving up. We're fighting until the last breath. But the soldier wasn't listening. In a desperate move, he raised his weapon and aimed it directly at Rhodes. I can't die here, the soldier said, his voice low and strained. I'm not going to die for nothing. Rhodes had no time to think. He grabbed the soldier's arm, twisting it, and sending the blaster flying out of his hand. With a swift motion, he knocked the soldier unconscious, his body slumping to the ground. Get it together, Rhodes muttered under his breath. This is not over. But even as he spoke the words, he knew it was getting harder to hold on to hope. The betrayal, the loss, the endless fighting. It was all weighing on him. How much longer could they keep going? The stakes had never been higher, and yet the road ahead seemed darker than ever. The Itari had given everything. They had sacrificed so much. But now, with the Krylocks at their doorstep, the question wasn't whether they would win, but whether they could survive. And the answer, Rhodes feared, might not be one they wanted to hear. The skies were streaked with the darkening red of the setting sun as the battle finally began to wind down. The air smelled of smoke and blood, and the ground beneath Rhodes' boots was a tangled mess of debris and fallen soldiers. Yet, despite the destruction, the sound of the Krylocks' forces retreating could be heard in the distance. The tide had finally turned. They had won. Rhodes stood alone on the battlefield, his rifle hanging loosely in his hand as he surveyed the aftermath. The roar of the Krylok ships fleeing into the sky was music to his ears, but it didn't drown out the quiet sorrow that had settled over him. Victory had come at a heavy cost. The Itari warriors, though victorious, had lost many of their own. Some of the human soldiers who had fought so valiantly by his side were gone, their lives claimed by the war. He thought of the faces he'd lost, the friends who had stood with him, only to fall in battle. Their sacrifices weighed on his heart, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be more to their fight than this. Their victory didn't feel like the triumph he had imagined. Vera appeared at his side, her face smeared with dirt and blood, but her eyes held the same fire they always had. She walked toward him, her steps steady despite the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was a leader, a warrior, but even she couldn't hide the grief in her eyes. You did it, she said quietly, standing beside him and looking out over the battlefield. We did it. Rhodes nodded, though his heart wasn't in it. Yeah, but at what cost? Vera gave a small, sad smile. The cost of freedom, of survival. Sometimes that's all we can do. But we're still standing. And that matters. Rhodes turned to face her, his gaze locking onto hers. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. We won't forget them, he said softly, the weight of his words sinking in. Their sacrifices won't be for nothing. Vera placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity and strength. We won't, and we'll rebuild. Together. The silence between them stretched for a moment as they both took in the gravity of the moment. The war was over, but the fight was far from finished. They had won, but there was still much to be done. The Itari would need help recovering. The wounded needed care. And most of all, they needed a future that was now theirs to shape. The sounds of movement around them broke the silence as other Itari warriors and human soldiers began to gather, forming a quiet circle around the two of them. Some were tending to the wounded, others were recovering the fallen, but all shared the same look in their eyes, a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The battle had been long, and their bodies bore the marks of it. But now, they could begin the healing process. Rhodes watched as the Itari women, their strong and resilient spirits undeterred by the hardships they had faced, began to work alongside the humans. It was a strange sight, a human and an alien race working side by side, not as enemies, but as allies, as family. He could see the trust growing between them, the shared determination to build something better. It wasn't just a victory over the Krylocks, it was a victory for a future built on unity. Vera's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's something I need to show you," she said, her tone serious but with an edge of excitement. "Come with me." Curious, Rhodes followed her through the makeshift camp, weaving through groups of soldiers and medics tending to the wounded. They stopped in front of a small gathering of Waiteri elders, their faces lined with age and wisdom. The elders were waiting for them, and as they saw Rhodes approach, they gave him a respectful nod. "Captain Rhodes," one of the elders spoke, his voice deep and gravelly, "we are grateful. You and your soldiers have done what we thought was impossible. You have saved our people, and now we owe you a debt we can never repay." Rhodes nodded, his face serious. "I did what any soldier would have done. We're not done yet. There's still a lot to rebuild." The elder smiled softly. "You speak of rebuilding, and that is why we called you here. We have something to offer you, a chance for a new beginning, a new future." Vera stepped forward and motioned toward the elder. "The Waiteri people have decided to honor your sacrifices, your courage, and your unwavering commitment. We want you to stay, to help us rebuild, to be a part of our future." Rhodes blinked, surprised by the request. "You want me to stay here, with you all?" The elder nodded. "You have earned our respect. Your leadership has shown us a path forward. And now we ask you to walk that path with us. Your human soldiers, those who survived, they are welcome to stay as well. Together, we can create something stronger than either of our peoples could have alone." Rhodes felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest as he absorbed the offer. It was unexpected, overwhelming even. The Waiteri, a race so different from humanity in so many ways, were offering him a place among them. It was a chance to build something new, something lasting. And though he wasn't sure what the future held, he knew this was an opportunity that could change everything. I don't know what to say," Rhodes admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "This is an honor, but I don't think I'm the right person for this." Vera smiled gently, her eyes warm with understanding. "You're exactly the right person, Rhodes. You've already proven it, and I'll be here to help you every step of the way. We'll build something better, together." As Rhodes looked around, he saw the faces of the Waiteri warriors who had fought alongside him. Vera, the Amazon warriors, and even the young ones who had never seen a human before. They all stood together, united in their shared victory. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. And in that moment, Rhodes knew that this was just the beginning. They had won the battle. Now, it was time to win the peace. With a final look at the battlefield behind them, Rhodes stepped forward, his heart swelling with the weight of the decision he had just made. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building a new world, one where humans and Waiteri could live and thrive side by side. And with that hope in his heart, Rhodes took his first step into that new future, knowing that the journey ahead would be long, but it was one worth taking. The sun had set completely now, and the darkness was no longer a symbol of defeat. It was a symbol of new beginnings, of a brighter future that lay ahead for both humanity and the Waiteri. Together, they would face whatever came next, united and stronger than ever.